Sometimes the most broken hearts find each other in the most unexpected places. When a hungry child offers her only treasure for a piece of bread, it changes everything for both of them. In a small frontier town, mountain man Connor Mitchell meets 10-year-old Violet, a barefoot girl trying to trade her beautiful golden hair for food. Connor has lived alone in the mountains for years, still grieving his own lost family. But when he sees this desperate child, something stirs in his heart. Instead of taking her hair, he offers her a home in his cabin. What happens next is a story about healing, trust, and how two strangers can become family. But can a gruff mountain man and a scared little girl really build a life together? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the peaks surrounding Cedar Ridge like a shroud of memory, and Connor Mitchell stood at his cabin window watching the sun struggle through the gray. His weathered hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee, the ceramic chipped from years of solitary mornings, just like this one. The silence up here was different from the silence in town. It held no judgment, no whispered conversations behind his back, no pitying glances from well-meaning neighbors who thought they understood his grief. He'd built this cabin with his own hands 15 years ago, back when Sarah was still alive and their daughter Emma would run barefoot through these same pine needles, her laughter echoing off the canyon walls. The memory hit him like it always did, sudden and sharp, and he pushed it down with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd learned that some wounds never truly heal. They just learn to hide better. The leather journal on his kitchen table lay open to yesterday's entry, his careful handwriting documenting the weather, the animals he'd spotted, the small repairs he'd made to the roof. It was a ritual he'd maintained since Sarah's passing, a way to mark time and prove to himself that he was still living, even when living felt more like enduring. The pages were filled with these mundane observations, but if someone looked closely, they might notice how the entries grew shorter during certain months, how his handwriting became more cramped around the anniversaries of loss. Connor set down his cup and closed the journal, running his thumb over the worn leather cover. Sarah had given it to him for their 5th wedding anniversary, insisting that a man who noticed everything, the way the light fell across the valley in autumn, the particular call of the hawk that nested near their bedroom window, the exact shade of blue in their daughter's eyes, should write those observations down. "You see the world differently than most people," she'd said, pressing the journal into his hands. "Someone should remember the beautiful things, beautiful things." He'd stopped writing about those after the accident. The ride down to Cedar Ridge took him 40 minutes on horseback, following a trail he'd worn smooth over the years. His horse, a sturdy bay mare named Belle, knew the path as well as he did, stepping carefully around the loose rocks and fallen logs that marked the descent. The town spread out below them, like a collection of weathered toys, its main street running parallel to the creek that gave the settlement its name. Cedar Ridge had been born from the gold rush 20 years earlier, but the easy pickings were long gone. What remained was a community of stubborn souls who decided to make a life from the harder work of farming, logging, and raising livestock. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where a man's reputation was built on handshakes and kept promises, where strangers were noticed immediately and their intentions scrutinized over coffee and gossip. Connor dismounted in front of Murphy's General Store, the same building where he'd met Sarah 16 years ago. She'd been working behind the counter then, new to town, and determined to make her own way. He'd come in for supplies and stayed for an hour, finding excuses to examine every item on the shelves just to hear her laugh at his obviously manufactured questions about the differences between various types of flour. The bell above the door chimed as he entered, and Tom Murphy looked up from the ledger he was updating. Tom had inherited the store from his father and carried the same gentle demeanor that had made the place a gathering spot for anyone who needed a kind word along with their purchases. "Morning, Connor. You're in early today. Need a few things?" Connor pulled a folded list from his shirt pocket, Sarah's careful handwriting still visible on the paper despite years of folding and refolding. He'd memorized the contents long ago, but couldn't bring himself to copy it onto new paper. As Tom gathered the items, salt, coffee, flour, sugar, Connor found his attention drifting to the corner where a small girl sat cross-legged on the floor, her back against a barrel of oats. She couldn't have been more than 10, with tangled golden hair that fell in loose braids past her shoulders. Her dress was torn in several places and far too large for her thin frame, as if it had been made for someone else, or perhaps she'd simply grown thinner than it had been tailored for. What struck him most were her eyes, too old for her face, holding a wariness that spoke of experiences no child should carry. She watched every person who entered the store with the careful attention of someone who'd learned that survival sometimes depended on reading the intentions of strangers. "Who's the girl?" Connor asked quietly, nodding toward the corner. Tom glanced over and lowered his voice. "Been coming around for about a week now. Says her name's Violet. Won't talk about where she came from or if she's got people somewhere. Martha tried to get her to stay at the boarding house, but she disappears every night and shows up here again when I open. She eating when she can. I've been letting her sweep up in exchange for a biscuit and some milk, but she's still too thin. Pride, you know. Won't take charity, but she'll work for food." Connor studied the girl more carefully. There was something in the set of her shoulders, the way she held herself apart from the world, that he recognized. It was the posture of someone who'd learned not to expect comfort from others, who'd built walls to protect what little they had left. "Connor Mitchell," Tom called, pulling his attention back to the counter. "You still up there in that cabin all by yourself?" It was the kind of question that carried weight in a small town, the sort that came with unspoken suggestions about what a man of his age should be doing with his life. Connor had heard variations of it for years. Gentle nudges toward remarriage, hints about moving back to town, invitations to social gatherings that he always declined. "Suits me fine," Connor replied. The same answer he always gave, "I'm sure it does. But a man needs purpose beyond just getting by. Especially a man with your skills." Tom was referring to Connor's past as a carpenter and builder. The trades he'd learned from his father and practiced until Sarah's death had driven him into the mountains. There'd been a time when half the houses in Cedar Ridge bore his craftsmanship, when people sought him out, not just for his skill, but for his ability to see what they needed before they could articulate it themselves. "I keep busy enough," Connor said, accepting his change and gathering his supplies. As he turned to leave, he heard a small commotion from the corner where Violet sat. A well-dressed woman had approached her, Mrs. Patterson, the banker's wife and self-appointed guardian of the town's moral standards. "Child, you simply cannot continue living like this. It's unseemly and dangerous. You'll come home with me and we'll get you cleaned up and properly fed." Violet shrank back against the barrel, her eyes wide with fear. "No, ma'am. Thank you kindly, but no. It's not a request, dear. A young lady of your age has no business living on the streets like some common vagrant. What would people think?" The interaction stirred something uncomfortable in Connor's chest. He recognized the woman's intentions as good, even admirable, but he also saw how the girl's breathing had quickened, how her hands had begun to shake. This was a child who'd learned to fear the well-meaning intervention of adults, who discovered that kindness sometimes came with strings that could strangle. Without fully deciding to do so, Connor found himself speaking. "Mrs. Patterson." The woman turned, her face brightening with the practiced smile she reserved for church socials and community gatherings. "Mr. Mitchell, how lovely to see you in town. I was just explaining to this poor child that she needs proper care. Seems to me she's managing on her own." "Oh. But surely you can see she needs what she needs," Connor said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from years of making decisions that mattered. "Is to be asked what she wants, instead of being told what others think she should want." Mrs. Patterson's smile faltered slightly, but her determination remained intact. "Really, Mr. Mitchell, she's just a child. Children don't always know what's best for them. Connor looked down at Violet, who was watching their exchange with the intensity of someone whose fate was being decided by others. What do you think, miss? You want to go with Mrs. Patterson? The girl shook her head once, a quick, definitive movement. There you have it, Connor said. But this is ridiculous, Mrs. Patterson protested. She can't simply live on the streets like some feral animal. There are standards, proper ways of doing things. What if something happens to her? Then that'll be her choice to make. The words surprised Connor even as he spoke them. He hadn't planned to get involved, hadn't intended to take a stance on the situation at all. But something about the girl's fear, the way she'd shrunk from the offer of help, reminded him of another time, another child who'd needed someone to simply listen instead of decide. Mrs. Patterson huffed her disapproval and departed in a rustle of skirts, muttering about mountain hermits who thought they knew better than civilized society. Connor remained where he was, studying Violet with new attention. "You have somewhere safe to sleep?" he asked. She nodded, though something in her expression suggested that safe was a relative term. Getting enough to eat? A shrug that could have meant anything. Connor made a decision that seemed to emerge from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. "I've got more work than I can handle up at my place. Splitting wood, organizing supplies, general maintenance. Pays fair, meals and a warm place to sleep. Work hard, earn your keep, no charity involved. Interested?" Violet stared at him for a long moment, her young face cycling through wariness, hope and calculation. Finally she spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "You're not like her, are you? You won't try to make me into something I'm not?" The question hit him with unexpected force. It spoke of experiences with adults who'd tried to reshape her into their vision of what a child should be, who'd mistaken their own needs for hers. "Can't make anybody into anything they don't choose to become," Connor replied. "Only thing I care about is whether you'll work hard and keep your word." She studied his face with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to read the difference between truth and convenient lies. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her, because she nodded once. "When would you want me to start?" "Today, if you're willing. Supplies need hauling up the mountain, and Belle can carry double if you don't mind riding." Violet looked toward the store's front window, where Connor's mare stood patiently tied to the hitching post. Something shifted in her expression, not quite a smile, but a softening around her eyes that suggested the idea of leaving town, of disappearing into the mountains with a stranger. Held more appeal than fear. "I don't have anything to pack," she said simply. Connor felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the same sensation he'd experienced watching Emma take her first steps, speak her first words, grow into herself day by day. It was the recognition of a moment that would matter, that would change the direction of things in ways he couldn't yet predict. "Then let's head home," he said, the word slipping out before he could stop it. Home. He hadn't used that word to describe his cabin in years. It had been his refuge, his hiding place, his self-imposed exile from a world that had taken everything he dared to love. But looking at this small girl with her ancient eyes and careful posture, Connor realized that home might be less about the place and more about the people you chose to share it with. As they rode up the mountain trail, Violet perched behind him on Belle's broad back. Connor found himself remembering things he'd forgotten. The particular way morning light fell across his kitchen table, the sound of laughter echoing off canyon walls, the simple pleasure of sharing a meal with someone who appreciated both the food and the company. For the first time in years, the silence of the mountains felt less like solitude and more like peace. The cabin felt different with another person in it. Connor noticed it immediately as he pushed open the heavy wooden door, Violet following close behind him with uncertain steps. The space that had been perfectly arranged for solitude, one plate, one cup, one chair at the small table, suddenly seemed to expose his years of isolation in sharp relief. Violet stood just inside the doorway, her eyes taking in every detail with the careful attention of someone who'd learned that understanding her environment could mean the difference between safety and danger. The main room was spartanly furnished but well crafted, everything built by Connor's own hands from local pine and oak. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its mantel bare except for a single photograph turned face down. The kitchen occupied the far corner, clean and organized with the precision of a man who found comfort in routine. "You can put your things," Connor began, then stopped, remembering that she'd said she had nothing to pack. The reality of her situation hit him again. A child with no possessions, no connections. Nothing but the torn dress on her back and whatever experiences had taught her to accept help from strangers with such calculated wariness. "There's a small room back there," he continued, nodding toward a door near the fireplace. "Used to be Emma's." He caught himself, the name slipping out before he could stop it. "It used to be a child's room. You can sleep there." Violet's gaze shifted to the overturned photograph on the mantel, then back to Connor's face. She didn't ask who Emma was, but something in her expression suggested she understood the weight of names that came with pain attached. "I don't need much space," she said quietly. "I'm used to sleeping wherever I can find a spot." The casual way she mentioned this, as if sleeping rough was simply a fact of life rather than a tragedy, stirred something protective in Connor's chest. He walked to the small room and pushed open the door, revealing a space he hadn't entered in over 7 years. The room was exactly as Emma had left it, a narrow bed with a faded quilt, a small dresser topped with carved wooden animals, shelves lined with books whose pages had been turned by small fingers countless times. Connor had meant to clear it out after the accident, had planned to pack everything away or give it to other children who might find joy in toys that had only brought him memories too painful to bear. But each time he'd approached the task, he'd found himself unable to disturb even a single item, as if changing anything would somehow erase what little remained of his daughter's presence. "I know it's been empty a while," Connor said, his voice rougher than he intended. "Might be dusty. I can clean it up, change the bedding." Violet stepped into the room with the reverence of someone entering a sacred space. She touched nothing, but her eyes took in every detail. The books arranged by size, the wooden horse with its painted mane, the quilt that someone had stitched with loving hands and infinite patience. "She was about my age?" Violet asked softly. Connor nodded, not trusting his voice for more. "What happened to her?" The question was asked without the careful politeness most adults used when approaching his grief. There was something direct and unsparing about it that caught him off guard, as if this child had already learned that terrible things happen to people and saw no point in pretending otherwise. "Accident," Connor said simply. "Her and her mother both. 7 years ago this winter." Violet absorbed this information with the same matter-of-fact acceptance she'd shown for everything else. "I'm sorry," she said, and somehow it didn't sound like the hollow condolence most people offered. It sounded like someone who understood that loss was simply part of the landscape they both navigated. "Bed's probably fine," she continued, running her hand lightly over the quilt. "And I like the books." Connor felt something ease in his chest, a tension he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. Emma loved those books, read them over and over, until she could recite whole pages from memory. Which one was her favorite? Connor moved to the shelf and pulled out a worn volume with a deep blue cover. "This one." Stories about a girl who lived in the mountains and could talk to animals. Emma used to pretend she could do the same thing, used to have whole conversations with the squirrels outside her window. Violet accepted the book with careful hands, opening to a page marked with a pressed flower, one of Emma's bookmarks that Connor had never had the heart to remove. "Would it be all right if I read it?" she asked. "Course. That's what books are for." As evening approached, Connor found himself struggling with the practical realities of sharing his space. He cooked the same simple meal he prepared every night, beans, cornbread, coffee, but found himself second-guessing everything. Was it too plain for a child? Too much salt? Should he have asked what she liked to eat? Violet ate with the focused attention of someone who'd learned not to take food for granted, cleaning her plate completely and thanking him with a formality that spoke of careful training in Manners, even as her circumstances suggested. A life far removed from proper etiquette. Tomorrow we'll start with the wood. Pile, Connor said as they finished eating. Winter's coming and I'll need to have enough split and stacked to last through the cold months. It's hard work, but if you're willing to learn, I'll teach you how to swing an axe properly. Violet nodded seriously. I've done hard work before. I learn quick and I don't complain. There was something both heartening and heartbreaking about her earnestness. The way she seemed to understand that earning her place here would require proving her worth through labor. Connor found himself wanting to tell her that she didn't need to prove anything, that a child should be valued simply for existing. But he sensed that such assurances would feel false to someone who'd clearly learned otherwise through difficult experience. As full darkness settled over the mountains, Connor showed Violet how to bank the fire for the night and where to find additional blankets if she got cold. The cabin's thick walls kept out most of the mountain chill, but nights at this elevation could be harsh even in late summer. There's a chamber pot under the bed, he said awkwardly, realizing he'd never had to consider such practical matters for a guest. And if you need anything during the night, just call out. I'm a light sleeper. Violet disappeared into Emma's room with the blue book tucked under her arm, and Connor settled into his familiar evening routine of updating his journal and preparing for another night of solitude. But the sounds from the other room, the soft rustle of pages turning, the creak of bed springs as she settled herself, reminded him how thoroughly his world had changed in the space of a single day. He was just drifting off to sleep when the screaming started. The sound cut through the night silence like a blade, raw, terrified, desperate. Connor was out of bed and moving before he was fully awake, his bare feet hitting the cold wooden floor as he rushed toward Emma's room. He found Violet tangled in the quilt, her body rigid with terror, her eyes wide open but seeing something far from the safety of his cabin. Her screams had dissolved into broken sobs, and she was fighting against the bedding as if it were holding her captive. Violet, Connor said quietly, not wanting to startle her further. You're safe. You're at my cabin in the mountains. You're safe now. It took several minutes for his voice to reach her, for the reality of where she was to penetrate the nightmare that held her. When she finally focused on his face, her expression crumpled with embarrassment and residual fear. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice hoarse from screaming. I didn't mean to wake you. I know you need your sleep, and I promised I wouldn't be trouble and— Hey, Connor interrupted gently. Nothing to apologize for. Bad dreams aren't something you can control. He sat carefully on the edge of the bed, maintaining enough distance to avoid crowding her, but close enough to offer comfort if she needed it. In the moonlight streaming through the window, he could see the tear tracks on her cheeks, the way her small hands still trembled with the aftershocks of whatever terror had claimed her sleep. You want to talk about it? He asked. Violet shook her head quickly. Just bad memories. They come at night sometimes. Connor understood that better than she could know. His own dreams were haunted by the sound of splintering wood, the sight of overturned wagon wheels, the terrible silence that had followed the avalanche that claimed his family. He knew how the mind could turn sleep into a battlefield where past horrors played out in endless variation. They'll get better, he said, though he wasn't sure if he was trying to convince her or himself. Having safe place to sleep, regular meals, knowing you don't have to worry about where you'll be tomorrow, it helps. Did yours get better? She asked, with the unsettling perceptiveness that seemed to characterize all her observations. Connor considered lying, offering the false comfort that time heals all wounds. But something about her direct gaze, the way she seemed to see through pretense to the truth beneath, made him choose honesty instead. Some, he said. They're not as frequent as they used to be, but they still come sometimes. Violet nodded, as if this confirmed something she already suspected. At least now I don't have to worry about someone finding me while I'm sleeping. That was always the worst part, being scared even when I was supposed to be resting. The casual way she mentioned this fear of being found, of being vulnerable while unconscious, painted a picture of her recent life that made Connor's chest tighten with protective anger. Whatever experiences had shaped her wariness of adults, whatever had driven her to the streets and taught her to sleep with one eye open, it had stolen her childhood as surely as if it had been taken by force. "Nobody's going to find you here," Connor said quietly. "And nobody's going to hurt you. I give you my word on that." Violet studied his face in the moonlight, searching for something. Whatever she found there seemed to satisfy her, because her rigid posture finally relaxed. "Thank you," she said simply. Connor remained sitting on the edge of the bed until her breathing deepened and sleep claimed her again. As he watched her small form beneath Emma's quilt, he realized that offering shelter to this frightened child had awakened something in him that had been dormant since the accident, the fierce protective instinct that had once driven him to check Emma's room multiple times each night, to worry about her safety, with an intensity that had sometimes amused Sarah. But this was different. Emma had been his by blood and by choice from the moment of her birth. Violet was a stranger who'd stumbled into his life carrying secrets and sorrows he could only guess at. Yet watching her sleep in his daughter's bed, surrounded by his daughter's books and toys, Connor felt the same overwhelming need to keep her safe that had once defined his days as a father. The realization should have terrified him. Instead, as he finally returned to his own bed, Connor found himself feeling something he'd almost forgotten was possible. Purpose that extended beyond mere survival. Responsibility that brought meaning instead of burden. For the first time in 7 years, he wasn't just a man getting through another day. He was someone who mattered to another person, someone whose presence could mean the difference between safety and fear for a child who'd known too little of the former and far too much of the latter. The transformation had begun, though neither of them fully understood it yet. The sound of Connor's axe splitting wood had become a familiar rhythm over the past 3 days. But this morning, it was accompanied by the softer taps of Violet, learning to use a smaller hatchet on kindling. She worked with the determined concentration of someone who understood that earning her place required mastering new skills, no matter how her small hands blistered or her shoulders ached from the unfamiliar motion. Connor paused in his work to watch her technique, noting how she held the tool exactly as he'd shown her and followed through with each swing, despite the obvious strain. There was something both admirable and troubling about her fierce independence, the way she pushed through discomfort without complaint, how she anticipated his needs before he voiced them, the careful attention she paid to his moods and preferences. "Let me see your hands," Connor said, setting down his axe. Violet hesitated for just a moment before holding out her palms. The blisters were worse than he'd expected, some already broken and raw, despite the work gloves he'd found for her. Gloves that had been Emma's, though he hadn't mentioned that detail. "We'll take a break," Connor said, pulling a clean cloth from his pocket. "Can't work if your hands are too torn up to hold the tools." "I can keep going," Violet protested, though she didn't resist when he began cleaning the broken blisters with gentle efficiency. "They don't hurt that much." Connor recognized the lie for what it was. Not deception, but the kind of stoic denial he'd seen in men who'd learned that showing weakness could be dangerous. It disturbed him to see such learned toughness in someone so young. "Pain's just information," he said, as he wrapped her palms with strips of clean cotton. "Body's way of telling you when something needs attention. Ignoring it doesn't make you stronger, just means you might do permanent damage to yourself." Violet absorbed this with the serious attention she gave to all his practical lessons. Over the past few days, Connor had found himself sharing knowledge he'd never thought to articulate, not just how to split wood or bank a fire, but the reasoning behind each technique, the accumulated wisdom of a lifetime spent working with his hands. "My pa used to say that pain was weakness leaving the body," Violet said quietly, then immediately looked as if she regretted sharing this piece of her past. Connor continued wrapping her hands, his movements steady and unhurried. "Your pa sounds like a man who never learned the difference between being tough and being smart." It was the first time she'd mentioned any family, and Connor found himself wanting to know more while also respecting the obvious boundaries she'd drawn around certain subjects. Whatever her relationship with her father had been, the brief mention carried weight that suggested complicated feelings. "There," Connor said, securing the bandages. "We'll let those heal up proper before you do any more splitting. Meantime, I've got another job that needs doing." He led her to his workshop, a smaller building attached to the cabin where he kept his carpentry tools and worked on projects during the long winter months. The space smelled of sawdust and linseed oil, with hand planes and chisels arranged on pegboards with the precision of someone who treated his tools as extensions of his own body. On the workbench sat a piece of mountain ash he'd been shaping for several days, its grain highlighted by careful sanding. Connor had started the project without any clear purpose in mind, working the wood simply for the meditative rhythm of the craft. But seeing Violet's careful attention to every meal, the way she ate with her hands, because his cabin had only contained one set of utensils, had given him direction. "What is it?" Violet asked, running her bandaged fingers lightly over the smooth curves. "Going to be a spoon," Connor replied, picking up a small carving knife. "Figured you might like one of your own, instead of having to borrow mine all the time." The simple statement seemed to affect Violet more than Connor had expected. She stared at the half-formed spoon with an expression he couldn't quite read. Surprise, gratitude, and something that might have been disbelief, all mixed together. "You're making it for me?" she asked, as if the concept of someone creating something specifically for her was foreign. Seemed practical. "Can't have you eating soup with your fingers through the winter." Connor kept his tone matter-of-fact, sensing that too much sentimentality might overwhelm her. But as he demonstrated the careful cuts needed to hollow out the bowl of the spoon, he found himself thinking about all the small accommodations that came naturally when you shared your life with another person. Extra blankets, a second chair at the table, the simple recognition that someone else's comfort mattered. "Can I watch you work on it?" Violet asked. "Course. Might even teach you to carve, if you've got the patience for it. Takes a steadier hand than splitting wood, but it's useful to know how to shape things to suit your needs." They worked in comfortable silence for the next hour, Connor carefully removing thin shavings of wood, while Violet observed his technique with the same focused attention she brought to every new skill. The workshop felt different with her presence. Less like a retreat from the world and more like a place where knowledge could be passed from one generation to the next. When they returned to the cabin for the midday meal, Connor was surprised to find Tom Murphy's wagon pulled up outside. The storekeeper himself sitting on the front porch with the patient air of someone who'd been waiting for a while. "Tom," Connor said with a nod. "What brings you up the mountain?" "Thought I'd check on how you folks are settling in," Tom replied, though his eyes were on Violet with obvious concern. "Word's gotten around town about your arrangement, and there's been some talk." Connor felt his shoulders tense. He'd known this was coming. Small towns thrived on gossip, and the sight of a bachelor mountain man taking in a mysterious child was bound to generate speculation and judgment. "What kind of talk?" Connor asked, though he could guess. "Oh, nothing malicious. Folks are just concerned about the propriety of the situation. Mrs. Patterson's been vocal about her feelings, and Sheriff Morrison's gotten some questions about whether everything's above board." Violet had gone very still beside Connor, her body language shifting into the defensive posture he'd seen that first day in the store. The easy relaxation she'd begun to show around the cabin disappeared, replaced by the wariness of someone who'd learned that adult conversations about her welfare rarely ended in her favor. "And what did you tell them?" Connor's voice carried a warning edge that made Tom shift uncomfortably. "I told them that I've known you for 16 years, that you're an honorable man who wouldn't harm a fly, and that the child looked a damn sight better fed and cared for than she did living on the streets." Tom's voice grew stronger as he spoke, as if reminding himself of his own convictions. "But Connor, you've got to understand their position. A man living alone with an unrelated child, it raises questions. Questions about what exactly?" "About legality. About guardianship. About what happens if something goes wrong or someone gets hurt. You've got no official standing as far as the law's concerned, no documentation of her background or circumstances. If the wrong person decided to make trouble, it could get complicated fast. Connor absorbed this information while watching Violet from the corner of his eye. Her face had gone pale, and he could see her fingers trembling slightly, the same tremor he'd noticed during her nightmares. "What do you suggest?" Connor asked quietly. "Talk to Sheriff Morrison. Get things documented proper. Maybe see if there's legal ways to formalize the arrangement so nobody can question your right to care for her." Tom's suggestions made practical sense, but Connor could see how they affected Violet, the way she seemed to shrink into herself at the mention of sheriffs and documentation, the careful blankness that had replaced her growing comfort with their domestic routine. "I'll think about it," Connor said. After Tom left, promising to deflect what questions he could, Connor found Violet sitting on Emma's bed, staring out the small window toward the mountains with an expression of resignation that broke his heart. "They're going to make me leave, aren't they?" she said without looking at him. Connor sat down beside her, careful to maintain the respectful distance he'd learned she needed. "Nobody's making you do anything you don't want to do, but if the law says it's not proper, then we'll figure out how to make it proper. Legal ways, like Tom said. There's always solutions, if you're willing to look for them." Violet turned to study his face with that unsettling adult perceptiveness. "You'd really do that? Go through legal trouble just for me?" The question revealed so much about her past experiences, the assumption that adults would choose convenience over her welfare, that she wasn't worth the effort of complicated solutions. "Yes," Connor said simply. "I would." For the first time since Tom's visit, Violet's rigid posture relaxed slightly. Why? It was a fair question, and Connor found himself considering it seriously. Why was he willing to navigate legal complications for a child he'd known less than a week? What had changed in him that made her welfare feel as important as his own? "Well, because everybody deserves someone who will stand up for them," he said finally. "And because this is your home now, if you want it to be." Violet nodded slowly, and Connor saw some of the fear leave her eyes. But as evening approached, and they settled into their routine of shared chores and quiet conversation, he couldn't shake the feeling that their peaceful interlude was more fragile than he'd realized. The outside world had noticed them, and with that notice came complications that threatened the simple healing they'd begun to find together. The wooden spoon Connor had carved for Violet sat beside her bowl, like a small declaration of belonging, its smooth surface gleaming in the lamplight as she used it to eat the venison stew he'd prepared for their evening meal. It had taken him 3 days to complete the carving, working on it during the quiet hours after Violet had gone to sleep, sanding and oiling the mountain ash until it felt perfect in small hands when he'd presented it to her that morning. Violet had held it with the careful reverence most people reserved for precious objects. She'd traced the grain with her fingertip and thanked him with a formality that suggested she wasn't accustomed to receiving gifts, especially ones made specifically for her comfort and use. "The stew's real good," Violet said, breaking Connor from his thoughts. "Better than anything I've had in a long time." Connor nodded his acknowledgement, but his attention was caught by what she hadn't said. Better than anything she'd had in how long? Months? Years? The careful way she'd cut herself off suggested a past she wasn't ready to share. Experiences that made a simple bowl of stew feel like luxury. Over the past week, their daily routines had begun to settle into a rhythm that felt surprisingly natural. Violet woke before dawn, as if some internal clock had been set by years of uncertainty, and Connor would find her sitting at the kitchen table, already dressed and waiting for the day's work to begin. She never had to be reminded of her chores, never complained about the physical demands of mountain life, and approached each new task with the determined focus of someone who understood that competence meant security, but it was the small moments between work that revealed the most about who she was becoming in this safe space. Yesterday, Connor had caught her humming while she swept the front porch, a soft, tuneless melody that had stopped the moment she realized he was listening. This morning, he'd found her carefully straightening the books on Emma's shelf. Not from any requirement he'd given her, but from what seemed to be an instinctive need to contribute to the order of their shared home. "Connor," Violet said suddenly, setting down her spoon with unusual hesitation. "Can I ask you something?" "Course. When you were teaching me to read Emma's books, you said she used to talk to the animals outside her window. Did you ever think she was just being fanciful, or did you believe her?" The question surprised Connor with its complexity. He set down his own spoon and considered it seriously, recognizing that his answer might matter more than it appeared on the surface. "I believed that she believed it," he said carefully. "And I believed that the animals understood something about her, even if it wasn't conversation the way adults think of it. Emma had a gentleness that drew creatures to her. Squirrels would take nuts right from her hand, and there was a young deer that used to come to the edge of the clearing just to watch her play." Violet absorbed this with the intense attention she gave to anything concerning Emma. Over the past week, she'd asked careful questions about Connor's daughter, what she'd like to eat, which books were her favorites, whether she'd been afraid of storms or darkness. The questions never felt invasive, more like someone trying to understand the history of a place before making herself comfortable in it. "I've been talking to the chickens," Violet admitted quietly. "Just little things, telling them about my day while I collect the eggs. They seem to listen, and sometimes they make sounds like they're answering back." Connor felt something warm settle in his chest. Emma used to do the same thing. "Said the hens were the best listeners on the mountain, because they never interrupted or gave advice, unless you asked for it. This earned him something he'd been waiting to see for days." Violet's first real smile since arriving at the cabin. It transformed her entire face, revealing dimples and making her eyes crinkle, in a way that reminded Connor powerfully of another little girl who'd found joy in simple conversations with barnyard animals. "She sounds like she would have been a good friend," Violet said. "She would have liked you," Connor replied, and was surprised to find he meant it completely. She always had a soft spot for anyone who was hurting or afraid. Used to bring home injured birds and try to nurse them back to health in a box by the fireplace. They finished their meal in comfortable silence. But Connor noticed how Violet lingered over the last few spoonfuls, as if reluctant to end the simple pleasure of a hot, filling dinner eaten in safety. When she finally set down her spoon, carved specifically for her hands, she looked at Connor with an expression that seemed to carry more weight than her years should allow. "I never had anyone make something just for me before," she said quietly. "Not anything useful anyway. My pa, he used to whittle little figures sometimes when he was drinking, but they were just decoration. Never something I could actually use." It was another glimpse into her past, offered with the same careful hesitance that marked all her personal revelations. Connor found himself wanting to ask more about her father, about the life that had led her to Cedar Ridge's streets, but he'd learned to let her share information at her own pace, rather than pressing for details she might not be ready to give. "Everyone deserves to have things made with them in mind," Connor said instead. "Things that fit their hands, suit their needs. It's one way people show they care about each other." Violet nodded, as if this was a lesson worth remembering. "Will you teach me to carve? I'd like to make something useful, too. What were you thinking of making? Maybe a handle for that old brush in the barn? The one with the broken grip that hurts your hand when you use it to groom Belle? I noticed you favoring your palm after you brushed her yesterday." Connor felt a familiar tightness in his throat. Her observation revealed not just attention to practical details, but genuine concern for his comfort, the kind of thoughtfulness that came naturally to people who understood what it meant to care for others and be cared for in return. "That's a fine idea," he said. "We'll start tomorrow after the morning chores are done." As they cleaned up from dinner, working together with the easy coordination they'd developed over their shared week, Connor found himself marveling at how quickly the cabin had adjusted to accommodate two lives instead of one. Violet's few possessions, a spare dress he'd purchased on his last trip to town, her own plate and cup, the blue book she read each night before sleep, had found natural places among his belongings without making the space feel crowded or invaded. But it was more than just the physical adjustments. The quality of silence in the cabin had changed, becoming less like isolation and more like companionable peace. Where once Connor had eaten his meals in the hollow quiet of solitude, now he found himself looking forward to Violet's careful observations about the day's work, or her thoughtful questions about the mountain's wildlife. "Connor?" Violet's voice interrupted his thoughts as she finished drying the last of the dishes. "Yes? When people in town ask questions about us, about me being here, does it worry you?" The directness of her question reminded Connor that despite her youth, Violet had clearly learned to pay attention to adult concerns and their potential consequences. He considered how to answer honestly, without adding to whatever fears she might be carrying. "I'm concerned about making sure everything's legal and proper," he said carefully. "But I'm not worried about anyone taking you away if you don't want to go. There are ways to make arrangements official, ways to satisfy people's questions about guardianship and documentation, and if I do want to stay, if this feels like home?" The word hung in the air between them, carrying the weight of hope and possibility that neither of them had dared to voice directly before now. "Then we'll make sure you can stay," Connor said firmly. "However long you want, whatever it takes to make it legal and right." Violet smiled again, the second genuine smile he'd seen from her, and Connor realized that somewhere in the space of 7 days, his mountain cabin had stopped being a refuge from the world and had become something he'd never expected to have again. It had become a home worth protecting. The weight of Connor's axe felt familiar in his hands as he demonstrated the proper stance for splitting logs. But watching Violet attempt to mirror his movements brought back memories he'd thought were safely buried. Emma had been younger when she'd begged to help with the woodpile, barely 6 years old and determined to swing an axe nearly as tall as herself. Sarah had protested, worried about accidents and injuries, but Connor had carved a small hatchet just for Emma's hands and taught her the same careful techniques he was now passing on to Violet. "Remember what I told you about following through," Connor said, adjusting Violet's grip on the hatchet handle. "The swing doesn't end when you hit the wood. It ends when the pieces fall apart." Violet nodded with the serious concentration she brought to all his lessons. Her tongue caught between her teeth as she focused on the mechanics of the motion. She'd been with him for 3 weeks now, and Connor had watched her transform from a wary, half-wild creature into something closer to what he imagined a normal child might be like, still cautious, still too quick to apologize for minor mistakes, but beginning to show flashes of curiosity and even playfulness that spoke to the person she might become in safety. The sound of her successful split, a clean crack, followed by the thud of 2 pieces hitting the ground, brought a grin to her face that reminded Connor painfully of Emma's triumph the first time she'd managed to split kindling on her own. "I did it!" Violet exclaimed, then immediately looked embarrassed by her own enthusiasm. "I mean, I got it right that time." "You did it," Connor confirmed, refusing to let her diminish her accomplishment. "That was a perfect split. Wood grain was tricky on that piece, but you read it right and hit it exactly where it needed to go." Violet's smile returned, less guarded this time, and she set up another piece with the careful attention Connor had taught her to pay to the wood's natural fracture lines. As she worked, Connor found himself sharing stories he hadn't spoken aloud in years, memories of Emma's first attempts at various mountain skills, the way she'd approached each new challenge with fearless determination that had both thrilled and terrified her parents. "She sounds like she was brave," Violet observed after Connor finished describing Emma's first successful fishing trip. "An adventure that had involved more falling in the creek than actually catching anything." "She was," Connor agreed. "But she was also smart about it. Never took chances just to prove something to herself or anyone else. Brave and careful, that's a good combination for mountain living. Is that what you're trying to teach me? To be brave and careful?" The question caught Connor off guard with its perceptiveness. He paused in his own wood splitting to consider it properly, recognizing that Violet's questions often revealed more about her inner thoughts than casual conversation might suggest. "I suppose I am," he said finally. But mostly, I'm trying to teach you that you can trust yourself to handle whatever comes along. Skills give you confidence, and confidence gives you the freedom to make choices instead of just reacting to whatever happens to you. Violet absorbed this wisdom with the thoughtful attention she gave to all his philosophical observations. Over the past weeks, Connor had discovered that she possessed an unusual capacity for serious thought, as if her experiences had forced her to develop intellectual maturity beyond her years. "Can I ask you something?" Violet said, setting down her hatchet and turning to face him directly. "Always. Why did you stop building things? Tom Murphy mentioned that you used to make furniture and build houses, but now you just live up here by yourself. Did it have to do with Emma and your wife dying?" The directness of her question was both startling and oddly comforting. Most adults approached his grief with careful indirection, tiptoeing around the subject as if speaking about loss might somehow make it contagious. Violet's straightforward curiosity felt more honest, less burdened with the assumptions and judgments that often accompanied adult sympathy. Connor leaned against his axe handle and considered how to answer, truthfully without overwhelming her with the depth of his own struggles. "After they died, I couldn't see the point anymore," he said slowly. "Building things, creating homes for other families, it all felt hollow. Like I was pretending that anything I made would last, that any of it mattered when everything I cared about could disappear in a single afternoon. But you're teaching me things now, making me a spoon, planning to help me carve that brush handle. That's building something, isn't it?" Her observation struck Connor with unexpected force. He hadn't thought of their daily lessons and small projects as construction. But she was right. He was building something with Violet, creating skills and knowledge and trust that would outlast both of them. "I suppose it is," he admitted. "Different kind of building, maybe." "Maybe the point isn't whether things last forever," Violet said thoughtfully. "Maybe the point is that they matter while they're here. Emma mattered even though she's gone now. The house you built for her still matters because it gave her a safe place to grow up, even if she couldn't stay there forever." Connor stared at this 10-year-old child who had somehow articulated something he'd been unable to understand in 7 years of grief and self-imposed isolation. The simplicity of her logic, that temporary didn't mean meaningless, that loss didn't negate the value of what had been, cut through his carefully constructed barriers with devastating accuracy. "How did you get so wise?" he asked quietly. Violet shrugged, suddenly looking every bit her actual age. "I think about things a lot. When you don't have much to do except worry about where you'll sleep or what you'll eat, your mind wanders to bigger questions, like why some people are kind and others aren't, or whether bad things happen for reasons or just because the world's dangerous sometimes. And what did you decide about that?" "I decided that reasons don't matter as much as what you do after the bad things happen. You can let them make you mean and scared, or you can look for the people who'll help you remember that there's still good things worth paying attention to." Connor felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of tension he'd carried so long he'd forgotten it was there. This child, who had every reason to be bitter and suspicious, had instead chosen to look for goodness in a world that had given her precious little evidence of its existence. "Is that what you think I've been doing for you?" he asked. "Helping you remember good things?" Violet nodded seriously. "And I think maybe I've been doing the same thing for you, even if we didn't plan it that way." The truth of her statement settled over Connor like a warm blanket on a cold morning. In caring for Violet, in teaching her and protecting her and simply enjoying her company, he had indeed been rediscovering the parts of himself that had gone dormant with grief. Her presence in his life had awakened purposes he'd thought were lost forever. The satisfaction of passing on knowledge, the quiet joy of shared meals and conversations, the profound meaning that came from being needed by someone who truly appreciated what he had to offer. "I think you're right," Connor said. And for the first time in years, his admission of being helped by someone else didn't feel like weakness or failure. Their afternoon of wood-splitting continued in comfortable silence. But Connor found his thoughts returning to Violet's observations about building and purpose, and the value of things that might not last forever. As he watched her master the rhythm of splitting kindling, her movements becoming more confident and efficient with each successful swing, he realized that without consciously deciding to do so, he had indeed begun building again. He was building Violet's confidence, her skills, her sense of belonging in the world. He was building trust between them, creating the foundation for a relationship that might last years or decades or whatever time they were granted together. And in doing so, he was rebuilding parts of himself that had been damaged by loss, not replacing what was gone, but creating something new that honored both his grief and his capacity for hope. The revelation should have frightened him, should have triggered all the protective instincts that had kept him isolated and safe from further loss. Instead, Connor found himself looking forward to tomorrow's lessons, to the gradual process of watching Violet grow into her own strength and wisdom. For the first time since the avalanche, building something felt like a privilege rather than a burden. The first frost of autumn had turned the mountainside into a tapestry of gold and crimson, and Connor woke to find Violet already at the kitchen window, her breath fogging the glass as she watched the sun rise over the transformed landscape. She'd taken to rising even earlier these past few days, as if the changing season had awakened some internal clock that urged her to witness each dawn. From the safety of their warm cabin, "It's beautiful," she said without turning around when she heard Connor's footsteps on the wooden floor. "I never saw colors like that before. Where I used to live, there weren't many trees, and the ones that were there never looked like this." Connor joined her at the window, coffee cup in hand, and followed her gaze across the valley, where aspens shimmered like scattered coins in the morning light. It had been Emma's favorite time of year. She'd called it the mountain's way of showing off before winter makes everything simple again. "Autumn's short up here," Connor observed. "Maybe 3 weeks between the first frost and the first snow. But it's worth paying attention to while it lasts." Violet nodded, her palm pressed against the cool glass. In the past month, Connor had watched her face lose the hollow angles of chronic hunger, had seen her shoulders relax from their perpetual defensive hunch. The child looking out at the autumn morning bore little resemblance to the desperate waif who'd tried to trade her hair for bread, but sometimes Connor caught glimpses of that wariness still lurking beneath her growing confidence. "Connor," Violet said quietly, still focused on the view outside, "I need to tell you something, and I'm afraid it might change how you feel about me." The words sent a chill through Connor that had nothing to do with the morning air seeping through the window frame. Over the past weeks, he'd grown accustomed to Violet's careful revelations about her past, but something in her tone suggested this confession carried more weight than her usual scattered memories. "Nothing you could tell me would change how I feel about you," Connor said carefully. "But I'm listening if you're ready to share it." Violet finally turned from the window, her young face carrying an expression of adult resolve. She walked to the table where Connor kept his morning coffee and sat down with the careful posture she adopted when preparing to discuss serious matters. "My name isn't really Violet," she began, her voice steady but small. "It's Victoria Pembroke, and I wasn't just some orphan living on the streets when you found me." Connor set down his coffee cup and gave her his full attention, recognizing that whatever she was about to share had been weighing on her conscience for weeks. "My father, my real father, he's a rich man back east, owns mines and railroads, and has a big house with servants and fancy things. And he was—" Violet's voice caught for just a moment before she pressed on. "He was mean to me. Not just strict or demanding, but truly cruel. When I didn't behave exactly how he wanted, or when I reminded him too much of my mother, who died when I was 7, he'd hurt me." Connor felt a familiar rage building in his chest, the protective fury that had been dormant for years, suddenly awakening with volcanic intensity. But he kept his voice gentle, recognizing that Violet needed his calm strength more than his anger right now. "What kind of hurt?" he asked quietly. "Beatings, mostly. And locking me in the cellar for days when I displeased him." He'd tell the staff I was ill or being punished for my own good, and they believed him because he was respected and important. Nobody questioned a wealthy man's right to discipline his own daughter however he saw fit. Violet reached into her dress pocket and pulled out a pressed wildflower, a small, purple bloom Connor recognized from the meadow behind their cabin. She'd picked it 3 days ago during one of their evening walks, and he'd watched her examine it with the careful attention she brought to all natural beauty. I picked this because it reminded me that there are still pretty things in the world even when everything else feels dark, she said, holding the flower gently. I wanted something to remember the first place I felt safe in years. Connor accepted the flower, understanding instinctively that this small gesture represented more than simple appreciation. It was an offering, a symbol of the trust she'd placed in him and the gratitude she felt for the sanctuary he'd provided. How did you end up here? Connor asked. Cedar Ridge is a long way from anywhere important enough to have mining fortunes. I ran away 6 months ago, took some money from his desk, not much, just enough for train fare, and headed west because I thought he'd be less likely to look for me in territories he considered beneath his notice. I've been moving from town to town, trying to stay ahead of anyone who might be searching, working when I could find jobs that didn't ask too many questions. The picture she painted of her recent months, a 10-year-old child navigating the dangers of frontier travel alone, surviving on her wits and whatever kindness she could find, made Connor's heart ache with retroactive worry for all the dangers she'd faced before finding her way to his mountain. Are you afraid he's still looking for you? Connor asked. Violet nodded, her fingers tracing the edge of the pressed flower. Rich men don't like losing their property, and that's how he saw me, something that belonged to him, to do with as he pleased. He'd never accept that I chose to leave, never admit that his own cruelty drove me away. He'll want me back so he can punish me properly for embarrassing him. And if he finds you, then I'll run again, Violet said with quiet determination. I'll keep running for the rest of my life if I have to, because I'd rather die free than live as his prisoner again. The fierce conviction in her young voice reminded Connor of a cornered animal's desperate courage, brave not because she felt no fear, but because the alternative to bravery was unacceptable. He found himself understanding, perhaps for the first time, why she'd approached his offer of shelter with such careful calculation, why she'd needed to prove her worth through work before accepting his kindness as genuine. What if you didn't have to run? Connor asked quietly. What do you mean? Connor stood and walked to the window, where Violet had been watching the sunrise, his mind working through possibilities he'd never considered before. The legal complications Tom Murphy had mentioned suddenly took on new dimensions, not just small-town propriety concerns, but questions of jurisdiction and parental rights that could have serious consequences for both of them. I mean, what if we made it legal for you to stay here? Official guardianship? Proper documentation that would give me the right to protect you from anyone who might try to take you back to a situation you don't want to be in. Violet stared at him with something approaching disbelief. You'd do that? Even knowing that my father has money and influence, that he might cause trouble for you if he found out where I was? Victoria, Connor said, using her real name for the first time, I'd do whatever it takes to keep you safe. Money and influence don't mean much up here in the mountains, and there are laws that protect children from cruel parents, even rich ones. Violet's eyes filled with tears, the first Connor had seen from her except during nightmares, but these seemed to spring from relief rather than pain. I was so afraid you'd send me away when you knew the truth, she whispered. I was afraid you'd decide I was too much trouble, too dangerous to have around. Connor crossed the room and knelt beside her chair, meeting her eyes at her level. Nothing about your past makes you too much trouble. Nothing about who your father is or what he did changes how I feel about having you here. You're not Victoria Pembroke running from a cruel man. You're Violet, the brave girl who chose to trust me with her safety. That's who you are now, Violet threw her arms around Connor's neck with sudden, fierce intensity, and he felt her small body shake with the release of fears she'd been carrying alone for far too long. As he held her, Connor realized that her confession had changed something fundamental between them, not his feelings for her, but the depth of responsibility he was willing to accept in protecting her. She wasn't just a lost child who'd wandered into his care. She was someone who'd chosen him specifically, who'd evaluated his character and found him worthy of her trust. The weight of that choice and the courage it had required her to make settled on Connor's shoulders like a mantle of honor he was determined to prove worthy of wearing. "Papa," Violet whispered against his shoulder, the words slipping out so naturally that Connor wondered if she'd even realized she'd said it. But she had realized it. And when she pulled back to look at his face, her expression held a question and a hope that took his breath away. Would it be all right if I called you that?" she asked quietly. Connor felt something break open in his chest, a wall he'd built around his heart, suddenly crumbling under the weight of this child's trust and affection. He'd never expected to be anyone's father again, had convinced himself that part of his life had died with Emma. But looking at Violet's hopeful face, he realized that being a father wasn't something you stopped being. It was something you became again when someone needed you to fill that role in their life. "I'd be honored," Connor said quietly, and meant it more completely than anything he'd said in years. Connor was splitting the morning's kindling when he heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching from the valley trail. Visitors to his mountain cabin were rare enough that the noise made him pause mid-swing, axe suspended above a piece of pine that would have to wait for his attention. Violet looked up from where she was feeding the chickens, her body going still with the alert wariness she'd never entirely lost, despite 6 weeks of safety. "Expecting anyone?" she asked quietly, though they both knew the answer. Connor shook his head, setting down his axe and wiping his hands on his work shirt. 2 men on horseback were climbing the final stretch of trail toward his cabin, and even from a distance he could see the glint of metal badges on their chests. Sheriff Morrison rode in front, his weathered face serious beneath his hat brim. Behind him, a stranger in expensive Eastern clothing sat uncomfortably in his saddle, clearly unused to mountain travel. But it was the third figure that made Connor's blood run cold, a small piece of paper fluttering from a wooden post that one of the men carried. Even before he could read the details, Connor recognized it as a wanted poster. And the child's face sketched on its surface bore an unmistakable resemblance to the girl now standing frozen beside the chicken coop. "Violet," Connor said quietly, never taking his eyes off the approaching riders. "Go inside. Get Emma's old traveling bag from the closet and pack whatever you need for a few days in the mountains. Do it now and don't let them see you." Violet didn't argue or ask questions. She'd learned to read danger in adult faces, and whatever she saw in Connor's expression sent her moving toward the cabin door with swift, silent steps. Connor positioned himself between the approaching men and his front door, his stance casual but ready. Sheriff Morrison dismounted first, his movements carrying the careful diplomacy of a man who'd known Connor for years, but was bound by duty to ask uncomfortable questions. "Morning, Connor," Morrison said, touching the brim of his hat in respectful greeting. "Sorry to bother you so early, but I've got someone here who's traveled a long way to ask you some questions." The stranger dismounted with considerably less grace, his expensive boots slipping on the mountain stone as he struggled to find his footing. Everything about him spoke of wealth and authority, from the gold watch chain visible across his vest to the way he held himself as if he expected the world to rearrange itself around his convenience. "Mr. Mitchell," the stranger said, his voice carrying the clipped accent of Eastern cities. "My name is Harold Pembroke. I believe you've been harboring my daughter." Connor kept his expression carefully neutral, though his heart was hammering against his ribs. "I'm not sure what you mean, Mr. Pembroke." Pembroke pulled the wanted poster from Sheriff Morrison's hands and held it up, the sketch of Violet's face fluttering in the mountain breeze. "This is Victoria Pembroke, my daughter, who disappeared from our home in Philadelphia 6 months ago." Several witnesses have placed a child matching her description in Cedar Ridge, and multiple sources have indicated that you've taken her into your home. The poster was more detailed than Connor had initially realized. Beneath the sketch, text offered a substantial reward for information leading to Victoria's safe return, describing her as a beloved daughter suffering from mental distress who had wandered away from proper care. The language was carefully chosen to suggest a tragic misunderstanding rather than a desperate escape, painting Connor as either a well-meaning fool or a potential criminal. Mr. Pembroke has legal documentation proving his paternal rights, Sheriff Morrison said, his tone apologetic but firm. Birth certificate, custody papers, witness statements about the child's disappearance. If you've been caring for his daughter, we need to discuss the proper way to handle the situation. Connor looked at the sheriff he'd known for 16 years, a man who'd shared drinks and stories and had never shown anything but respect for Connor's judgment. But Morrison's hands were tied by law and procedure, and the complicated reality of Violet's situation couldn't be easily explained in terms that would satisfy legal requirements. Mind if we all sit down and discuss this like civilized men? Connor asked, gesturing toward the rough wooden chairs on his front porch. As they settled themselves, Connor caught a glimpse of Violet's face in the cabin window, pale and frightened, but resolute. She'd packed quickly and was waiting for his signal, ready to disappear into the mountain wilderness they'd explored together over the past weeks. The knowledge that she trusted him enough to follow his lead, even in circumstances this dangerous, gave Connor strength to face what was coming. "Mr. Mitchell," Pembroke began, his voice taking on the practiced authority of a man accustomed to getting his way. "I don't know what lies my daughter may have told you about our family circumstances, but I assure you that Victoria suffers from a condition that causes her to fabricate elaborate stories about mistreatment. She's a troubled child who requires specialized medical care, not the indulgence of mountain living." Connor studied Pembroke's face as he spoke, noting the calculated way he chose his words, the manner in which he dismissed his daughter's character while positioning himself as a concerned parent dealing with a difficult child. Everything about the man's presentation felt rehearsed, designed to preempt any accusations Violet might have made about her treatment. "What kind of medical condition?" Connor asked quietly. "Hysteria combined with a tendency towards self-harm," Pembroke replied smoothly. "She creates elaborate fantasy scenarios in which she's the victim of various imagined cruelties. It's heartbreaking for a father to watch. But the doctors assure me that with proper treatment and firm guidance, she can learn to distinguish reality from her unfortunate delusions." The clinical way Pembroke described his daughter's supposed condition made Connor's skin crawl. It was the perfect explanation for dismissing anything Violet might say about her treatment. Every accusation could be attributed to mental illness. Every attempt to escape could be reframed as evidence of her need for closer supervision. Sheriff Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Connor, I've got to ask directly, is the Pembroke girl here? Has she been staying with you?" Connor met Morrison's eyes steadily. "There's a child here named Violet. She came to me needing work and shelter, and I've provided both. She's been nothing but respectful and hard-working, and I've grown fond of having her around." "Violet is a name she adopted during her illness," Pembroke interjected quickly. "She often refuses to acknowledge her true identity. It's part of her condition, a rejection of reality that requires consistent correction." "Mr. Pembroke," Connor said carefully, "what you're describing sounds less like mental illness and more like a child who's learned not to trust the adults in her life. In my experience, children don't fabricate stories about cruelty unless they've experienced something that taught them to expect it." Pembroke's friendly mask slipped slightly, revealing something harder underneath. "Mr. Mitchell, I appreciate your concern, but you're not qualified to diagnose or treat my daughter's condition. What she needs is proper medical supervision and the structure that only a father can provide." I've traveled over 1,000 miles to retrieve her, and I'm not leaving without her. And if she doesn't want to go with you?" Connor asked. "What she wants is irrelevant," Pembroke snapped, his true nature finally showing through his polite facade. "She's a child, and a troubled one at that. Children don't know what's best for themselves. That's why they have parents to make decisions for them." Sheriff Morrison looked increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "Connor, I understand your attachment to the child, but the law is clear about parental rights. Mr. Pembroke has documentation proving he's the girl's legal father, and unless there's evidence of criminal wrongdoing—" "There is evidence," Connor interrupted quietly, "if you're willing to look for it." Both men stared at him, Pembroke with growing anger and Morrison with cautious hope. "What kind of evidence?" Morrison asked. "The kind that a child carries on her body when she's been beaten regularly by someone bigger and stronger," Connor replied. "Scars that don't come from accidents or childhood mishaps. Marks that tell a story about what happens when a man thinks his wealth and position give him the right to hurt someone who can't fight back." Pembroke shot to his feet, his face flushing with rage. "How dare you suggest I've never laid a hand on that child in anger? Any injuries she may have sustained are the result of her own self-destructive behavior, which is precisely why she needs professional care." Connor remained seated, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to Pembroke's agitation. "Then you won't mind if Sheriff Morrison examines her and documents what he finds? If her injuries are self-inflicted as you claim, that should be apparent to someone with law enforcement experience." Morrison nodded slowly. "That's reasonable, Mr. Pembroke. If your daughter has been harming herself, documenting her condition would be important for her medical treatment. And if there's evidence of abuse, well, that changes everything about the legal situation." Pembroke's eyes darted between the two men, clearly calculating his options. Connor could almost see him weighing the risk of allowing an examination against the danger of refusing one. "Very well," Pembroke said finally, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "But I want it noted that any marks you find are the result of her mental condition, not any failure on my part as a father. And when this examination proves my point, I expect full cooperation in returning her to my custody." Connor stood slowly, his full height making him tower over the Eastern businessman. "Mr. Pembroke, if that examination shows what I think it's going to show, the only place you'll be taking your daughter is into a courtroom to answer for what you've done to her." As he spoke, Connor caught another glimpse of Violet's face in the window, and he saw something there that gave him hope, not just fear, but determination. She'd been listening to the conversation, and she'd heard him defending her, fighting for her right to safety and truth. Whatever happened next, she would know that someone believed her story enough to stand up to her father's wealth and influence. The moment of revelation was coming, and with it, the chance to expose the lies that had allowed Harold Pembroke to terrorize his daughter with impunity. Connor only hoped that the evidence Violet carried would be clear enough to overcome a rich man's ability to bend the law to his will. The real battle for Violet's future was about to begin. The small examination room behind Sheriff Morrison's office had never been intended for the kind of careful documentation they were about to undertake, but it was the most private space available in Cedar Ridge's modest law enforcement facilities. Connor waited outside the closed door while Morrison conducted the medical examination, his hands clenched so tightly that his knuckles had gone white beneath weathered skin. Harold Pembroke paced the outer office like a caged animal, his expensive clothing now rumpled from the mountain journey, and his earlier composure completely shattered. Every few minutes, he would stop his restless movement to glare at Connor with undisguised hatred, as if the mountain man's insistence on documentation had been a personal attack rather than a reasonable request for truth. "This is barbaric," Pembroke muttered for the third time in 10 minutes. "Subjecting a mentally disturbed child to this kind of examination based on the wild accusations of a mountain hermit. I'll have your badge for this, Morrison." Sheriff Morrison's voice came through the door, calm and professional. Mr. Pembroke, I need you to remain quiet while I complete this examination. Any interference could compromise the legal validity of my findings. Connor pulled Sarah's wedding ring from his shirt pocket, the thin gold band he'd carried close to his heart for 7 years since her death. He'd been considering this decision since the moment Pembroke had arrived at his cabin, weighing the symbolic weight of letting go against the practical need for resources that might help protect Violet. The ring represented his connection to a past that would always be part of him, but selling it could provide the money needed for legal representation, travel expenses, or whatever other costs might arise in the battle ahead. "She's been through enough already," Pembroke continued his complaints, apparently unable to remain silent despite Morrison's instructions. "This examination is nothing more than a fishing expedition designed to validate the delusions she's shared with her kidnapper." "Mr. Pembroke," Connor said quietly, his voice carrying a warning edge, "that child isn't delusional and she wasn't kidnapped. She found her way to safety on her own, and she chose to trust me with her welfare. The only question now is whether the law will protect her right to that choice." "Children don't have rights that supersede parental authority," Pembroke snapped. "I am her father, and I will decide what's best for her future." "Money spent on the finest doctors and private institutions, money spent on silencing anyone who might question your methods," Connor interrupted. "Money used to convince people that a frightened child's cries for help are symptoms of mental illness rather than evidence of abuse." The door to the examination room opened before Pembroke could respond, and Sheriff Morrison emerged with an expression that immediately told Connor everything he needed to know. The sheriff's face was pale with suppressed anger, and his hands trembled slightly as he closed the door behind him. "Mr. Pembroke," Morrison said, his voice carefully controlled, "I need you to understand that what I've documented in that room constitutes clear evidence of systematic physical abuse. Multiple healed fractures in various stages of healing, scarring consistent with repeated beatings, and signs of prolonged malnutrition that speak to deliberate neglect." Pembroke's face went through a series of rapid changes: surprise, calculation, and finally a return to his practiced mask of concerned authority. "Sheriff, as I explained earlier, Victoria suffers from a compulsive self-harm condition that no child inflicts the kind of injuries I've documented on herself." Morrison cut him off sharply. "I've seen self-harm, Mr. Pembroke, and I've seen abuse. What that little girl carries on her body is the result of adult violence, not childhood mental illness." Connor felt a mixture of vindication and heartbreak wash over him. He'd known what Morrison would find, but having it confirmed by legal authority made Violet's past suffering feel newly real and terrible. The child who'd learned to carve wood and split kindling, who'd called him Papa and trusted him with her safety, had survived years of systematic brutality before finding her way to his mountain. "Furthermore," Morrison continued, pulling a small notebook from his shirt pocket, "the child has provided detailed, consistent accounts of specific incidents of abuse, dates, locations, witnesses who were present, information that would be impossible to fabricate with the accuracy and detail she's provided." "Children with her condition are remarkably inventive," Pembroke replied, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. "They can create elaborate fantasy scenarios that seem completely believable, even to trained professionals." Morrison opened his notebook and began reading in a flat, official tone. "Victoria reports that on March 15th of this year, you struck her across the face with sufficient force to loosen 2 teeth because she spilled wine on a tablecloth during a dinner party. Dr. Whitman, your family physician, was present and treated the resulting injury. She also reports that on January 23rd, you locked her in the basement storage room for 3 days without food because she questioned your business practices in front of a guest. Your housekeeper, Mrs. Caldwell, brought her water against your specific instructions." Connor watched Pembroke's face carefully as Morrison read, noting the way the man's expression shifted from dismissive confidence to growing alarm. These weren't vague accusations. that could be attributed to a disturbed child's imagination. They were specific, incidents with named witnesses and verifiable details. Victoria has provided the names of 12 individuals who witnessed various incidents of abuse over the past 2 years, Morrison continued. She's also detailed the locations of documentation you keep in your home office, photographs, medical records, correspondence with institutions specializing in the treatment of difficult children. She knows about things that a mentally disturbed child couldn't possibly fabricate. Pembroke's composure finally cracked completely. That little witch has been spying on me, going through my private papers. So you admit the papers exist? Connor asked quietly. The question hung in the air like smoke, and Connor could see Pembroke realizing that his anger had led him into a trap. By acknowledging the existence of documentation, he'd essentially confirmed the accuracy of Violet's detailed knowledge about his activities. I want to see my daughter, Pembroke said abruptly, changing tactics. I have a legal right to speak with her, to hear these accusations directly and respond to them appropriately. Actually, you don't, Morrison replied, consulting his notebook again. Based on the evidence I've documented, I'm placing Victoria Pembroke in protective custody, pending a full investigation into allegations of child abuse. You'll have no contact with her until this matter is resolved through proper legal channels. The words hit Pembroke like physical blows. His face flushed purple with rage, and for a moment Connor thought the man might actually attempt violence against the sheriff. But Pembroke was too calculating for such obvious mistakes. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a leather portfolio thick with official-looking documents. Sheriff Morrison, you're making a serious error in judgment, Pembroke said, his voice returning to its earlier controlled authority. I have telegrams here from the mayor of Philadelphia, letters of recommendation from 3 different judges, and medical opinions from the most respected physicians in Pennsylvania. These documents establish my reputation as a pillar of the community and a devoted father dealing with a tragically disturbed child. Morrison accepted the portfolio, but didn't open it immediately. Mr. Pembroke, I don't care if you have letters from the president himself. The evidence of abuse is clear and documented, and no amount of character references will change what I've seen with my own eyes. You're a small-town sheriff in a backwards mountain community. Pembroke snarled, his mask finally slipping completely away. Do you have any idea who you're dealing with? I own senators, judges, entire police departments. I can have you removed from office with a single telegram, and I can make sure you never work in law enforcement again. The threats revealed more about Pembroke's true character than any of Violet's accusations could have conveyed. Connor saw a man who'd spent years using wealth and influence to avoid accountability, who genuinely believed that money could purchase immunity from consequences. It was exactly the kind of arrogance that would lead someone to abuse a helpless child while maintaining a public reputation for respectability. Mr. Pembroke, Morrison said calmly, you're welcome to send all the telegrams you want. But until this investigation is complete, Victoria Pembroke will remain under the protection of this office, and you'll have no contact with her whatsoever. Connor felt a surge of respect for the sheriff, who was willing to risk his career to protect a child from her own father. It was the kind of principled stand that Connor had hoped for, but hadn't dared to expect, especially when facing an adversary with Pembroke's resources and connections. Where will she stay? Connor asked. She'll need somewhere safe while the investigation proceeds. Morrison considered this question carefully. Normally, we'd place her with a local family approved for temporary custody. But given the unusual circumstances, and considering that she's already established a relationship with you, absolutely not, Pembroke interrupted. I won't have my daughter living with her kidnapper while you conduct this ridiculous investigation. He's not a kidnapper, Morrison replied firmly. Mr. Mitchell provided shelter to a child in need, and based on the evidence, his care has been beneficial to her physical and emotional welfare. Unless you can provide legal grounds for preventing the arrangement, she'll remain in his custody during the investigation. Connor felt a mixture of relief and apprehension at this decision. He wanted Violet to stay with him, wanted to continue providing the safety and stability she'd found in their mountain home. But he also understood that Pembroke would use every resource at his disposal to challenge the arrangement, and Connor's simple mountain life might not provide adequate protection against a wealthy man's determination for revenge. "There's something else we need to discuss," Morrison said, addressing Connor directly. "Mr. Pembroke isn't the only one who'll be facing legal scrutiny. If you're serious about providing permanent protection for Victoria, you'll need to pursue formal adoption proceedings. That means court hearings, legal documentation, and the possibility that Pembroke's lawyers will challenge your fitness as a guardian." Connor nodded, understanding the implications. The quiet life he'd built in the mountains, the healing he'd found in solitude and simple work, would have to be sacrificed to navigate the complex legal battle ahead. But looking at the closed door behind which Violet waited, probably frightened and uncertain about her future, Connor knew that no sacrifice was too great to ensure her safety. "I'll do whatever it takes," Connor said quietly. "Whatever legal procedures are required, whatever evidence needs to be gathered, whatever costs are involved, I'll handle it." As he spoke, Connor's fingers closed around Sarah's wedding ring in his pocket, and he made the final decision to let go of this last, tangible connection to his past. The ring represented 7 years of grief and isolation, but selling it would provide the resources needed to secure Violet's future. It was time to stop protecting the memory of what he'd lost and start building something new worth protecting. The real battle was just beginning. But for the first time since Pembroke's arrival, Connor felt confident that they had a chance to win. The courthouse in Pine Valley was larger than anything Cedar Ridge could offer, its wood-paneled courtroom filled with an unusual crowd for what should have been a routine custody hearing. Word had somehow spread beyond the immediate community, drawing curious onlookers, journalists from Denver, and an impressive collection of lawyers in expensive suits who had arrived on the morning train with Harold Pembroke. Connor sat at the plaintiff's table with his own attorney, a weathered man named Judge Patterson, who had come out of semi-retirement specifically for this case. Patterson had practiced family law for 30 years before moving to the mountains for his health. But Violet's situation had stirred something in the old lawyer that made him willing to face Pembroke's legal team, despite being outnumbered 4-1. Violet sat between Connor and Patterson, wearing a simple blue dress that Connor had purchased for the occasion. She looked impossibly small in the formal setting, but her posture was straight and her expression determined. Over the past 2 weeks of preparation, Connor had watched her transform her fear into resolve, understanding that this hearing would determine whether she returned to her father's house or remained free to choose her own family. Sheriff Morrison occupied the witness chair, the gleaming badge on his chest catching the morning light streaming through the courtroom's tall windows. In his hands, he held the official documentation of his examination, photographs, medical reports, and detailed notes that painted a horrifying picture of systematic child abuse disguised as parental discipline. The prosecuting attorney, a sharp-faced man named Williamson who clearly commanded substantial fees, rose from behind Pembroke's table with theatrical confidence. Everything about his presentation suggested that he considered this hearing a mere formality before returning a troubled child to her rightful father. "Sheriff Morrison," Williamson began, his voice carrying the polished authority of someone accustomed to courtroom victories. "Well, you've testified that you found evidence of healed injuries on my client's daughter. But isn't it true that you have no medical training beyond basic first aid?" Morrison's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "That's correct, sir. But I have seen enough injured children in 20 years of law enforcement to recognize the difference between accidental harm and deliberate abuse. Yet you're asking this court to accept your amateur medical opinion over the documented assessments of qualified physicians who have examined Victoria Pembroke extensively. Patterson stood slowly, his age-spotted hands gripping the table edge. "Objection, Your Honor. The witness has not been presented with any medical assessments from qualified physicians. Mr. Pembroke has provided character references and general statements about his daughter's supposed mental condition, but no specific medical documentation of the injuries," Sheriff Morrison observed. Judge Crawford, a stern-faced woman in her 50s who had presided over family court for nearly 2 decades, consulted her notes with careful attention. "Sustained. Mr. Williamson, do you have medical documentation that specifically addresses the injuries Sheriff Morrison has described?" Williamson's confident expression faltered slightly. "Your Honor, my client's daughter suffers from a documented history of self-destructive behavior that adequately explains any injuries she may have sustained. The pattern of self-harm is well established in her medical records that conveniently fail to document the specific injuries I observed," Morrison interjected, his voice carrying the weight of professional indignation. "Broken bones, systematic scarring, evidence of prolonged malnutrition. These aren't symptoms of childhood mental illness. They're proof of adult violence." Connor watched the exchange with growing hope, recognizing that Williamson's polished confidence was beginning to crack under Morrison's straightforward testimony. The sheriff's lack of medical training, which should have been a weakness in their case, was actually highlighting the absence of legitimate medical documentation from Pembroke's supposed team of experts. "Furthermore," Morrison continued, pulling a thick folder from his briefcase, "I've received correspondence from Dr. Marcus Whitman, Mr. Pembroke's family physician in Philadelphia. Dr. Whitman states that he was never asked to examine or treat Victoria for self-inflicted injuries. In fact, he reports that the injuries he treated were always explained as accidents, and he was specifically instructed never to discuss Victoria's medical condition with anyone outside the Pembroke household." The courtroom stirred at this revelation, and Connor saw Pembroke lean forward to whisper urgently in Williamson's ear. The lawyer's face grew pale as he absorbed whatever his client was telling him, and Connor realized that Dr. Whitman's cooperation had not been anticipated by Pembroke's legal strategy. "Dr. Whitman also states," Morrison continued, "that he became increasingly concerned about the pattern of injuries he was asked to treat, but his attempts to report his suspicions to local authorities were blocked by Mr. Pembroke's influence with the Philadelphia Police Department." Judge Crawford leaned forward in her chair, her expression grave. "Sheriff Morrison, are you testifying that there were previous attempts to investigate allegations of child abuse that were suppressed?" "Yes, Your Honor. Dr. Whitman provided documentation showing that he filed 3 separate reports with Philadelphia authorities over the past 2 years, all of which were dismissed without investigation after Mr. Pembroke made certain phone calls to his political contacts." The weight of this testimony settled over the courtroom like a heavy blanket. Connor felt Violet's small hand slip into his, and he squeezed gently, offering what comfort he could, while trying to process the implications of Morrison's revelations. Pembroke hadn't just abused his daughter. He'd systematically corrupted the institutions meant to protect children in order to maintain his ability to continue the abuse. Williamson rose again, but his earlier confidence had been replaced by desperation. "Your Honor, these are serious allegations being made against a respected member of the Philadelphia business community based entirely on the word of a small-town sheriff and a mentally disturbed child. My client demands the right to face his accusers and respond to these charges appropriately. Your client will have that opportunity," Judge Crawford replied firmly. "But first, I want to hear directly from Victoria Pembroke herself. Young lady, are you prepared to testify about your experiences in your father's household?" Violet stood slowly, her hand still clasped in Connor's. Her voice was quiet but clear as she answered, "Yes, Your Honor, I'm ready to tell the truth about what happened to me." Connor felt his heart swell with pride and protectiveness as he watched this brave child prepare to face her abuser in open court. The next few minutes would determine whether her courage would be rewarded with freedom or whether Pembroke's wealth and influence would prevail over justice and truth. Violet walked to the witness stand with steady steps, her small frame dwarfed by the formal courtroom setting, but her posture radiating a quiet strength that commanded attention from every person present. Connor watched her place her hand on the Bible and swear to tell the truth, understanding that this moment represented everything they had worked toward during weeks of legal preparation. Judge Crawford's voice was gentle but official as she addressed the child. "Victoria, I want you to understand that you're in a safe place here, and no one can hurt you for telling the truth about your experiences. Can you tell the court about your life in your father's house?" Violet's clear voice carried to every corner of the silent courtroom. "My father hurt me regularly from the time I was 7 years old. He used his fists, leather straps, and sometimes wooden rods to beat me when I displeased him in any way. He told me that if I ever spoke about our family business to anyone outside the house, I would be sent to an institution for disturbed children, where I would be treated much worse." Harold Pembroke half rose from his chair, his face flushed with rage. But Williamson quickly pulled him back down, with urgent whispers about courtroom decorum and legal strategy. "Can you give the court specific examples of this treatment?" Judge Crawford asked gently. Violet nodded, her hands folded carefully in her lap. "On my 8th birthday, I accidentally knocked over a vase while playing in the parlor. My father locked me in the basement storage room for 2 days without food as punishment. Mrs. Caldwell, our housekeeper, brought me water when she could sneak away from her duties. But she was afraid of losing her position if my father discovered her kindness." Connor watched the faces of the jury members as Violet spoke, seeing their expressions shift from polite attention to growing horror as she detailed her experiences with calm precision. Her testimony wasn't delivered with the emotional hysteria that might have suggested fabrication. Instead, she spoke with the matter-of-fact tone of someone recounting events that had become unfortunately routine. "Last Christmas, my father hosted a dinner party for business associates," Violet continued. "When I came downstairs to wish the guests a pleasant evening, as I had been taught was proper behavior, my father struck me across the face hard enough to knock me down because he said children should not be seen or heard when adults were conducting business. Was anyone else present during this incident?" Patterson asked from his table. "Yes, sir. Dr. Whitman was there, along with Judge Harrison from the Philadelphia courts, and several other gentlemen whose names I don't remember. Dr. Whitman examined my face afterward and told my father that such discipline was excessive. But my father said that outsiders didn't understand what was required to properly manage a difficult child." The courtroom stirred at this testimony, and Connor saw several jury members exchange meaningful glances. Violet was providing corroborating details that matched perfectly with Dr. Whitman's written statement, creating a pattern of evidence that would be difficult for Pembroke's lawyers to dismiss. Judge Crawford leaned forward slightly. "Victoria, why did you decide to run away from your father's house?" For the first time, Violet's composed expression showed a flicker of emotion. "Because I realized that I would rather die free than live as his prisoner any longer. I knew that if I stayed, the beatings would continue to get worse, and eventually he might hurt me badly enough that I wouldn't survive. Running away was dangerous, but staying was certain death." The simple dignity with which she delivered this statement hit the courtroom like a physical force. Connor felt tears sting his eyes as he realized the incredible courage it had taken for this 10-year-old child to make such a calculation and act on it, choosing uncertain freedom over guaranteed abuse. "And how has your life been different since you've been living with Mr. Mitchell?" Patterson asked. Violet's face brightened with the first genuine smile Connor had seen from her all day. "Mr. Mitchell, my papa, has never raised a hand to me in anger. He teaches me useful skills like woodworking and animal care, and he listens when I have questions or concerns. He makes me feel safe and valued for who I am, not afraid of making mistakes that might bring punishment. Do you want to return to your father's house?" Judge Crawford asked directly. "No, Your Honor," Violet replied without hesitation. "I want to stay with Papa Connor. who has shown me what it means to be part of a real family where people care for each other instead of hurting each other." Williamson rose for cross-examination, but his earlier confidence had completely evaporated. "Victoria, isn't it true that you've been coached by Mr. Mitchell to say these things about your father? That you've been taught to exaggerate normal parental discipline to make it sound like abuse?" Violet looked directly at her father for the first time since entering the courtroom, her gaze steady and unafraid. "Sir, no one had to teach me the difference between discipline and cruelty. I learned that difference by living through both." The power of her simple response silenced the entire courtroom. Even Williamson seemed at a loss for words, shuffling through his notes as if searching for a line of questioning that might undermine testimony delivered. With such quiet conviction, Judge Crawford consulted her notes for several long minutes before speaking. Based on the evidence presented, including medical documentation, witness testimony, and the child's own account of her experiences, this court finds clear and convincing evidence of systematic child abuse. Mr. Harold Pembroke, you are hereby stripped of all parental rights regarding Victoria Pembroke, and she is permanently removed from your custody. The gavel's sharp crack echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot, finalizing the decision that would determine the rest of Violet's life. Connor felt her small hand grip his tightly as she processed the magnitude of what had just occurred. She was truly free from her father's control, free to choose her own family and future. Furthermore, Judge Crawford continued, I am approving Mr. Connor Mitchell's petition for legal adoption, effective immediately. Victoria Pembroke will henceforth be known as Violet Mitchell, and all rights and responsibilities of parenthood are transferred to Mr. Mitchell. As the courtroom erupted in quiet celebration, Connor pulled Violet into his arms, feeling the weight of 7 years of grief and isolation finally lifting from his shoulders. They had won more than a legal victory. They had won the right to heal together as a chosen family. The official adoption papers lay spread across Connor's kitchen table like a map to a new future, their legal language transformed into something sacred by the simple addition of 2 signatures, his own careful script and Violet's determined letters forming her new name, Violet Mitchell. The documents represented more than a change of custody. They were proof that families could be chosen as surely as they could be born, that love could triumph over law when justice demanded it. 3 months had passed since the courthouse victory that freed Violet from her father's control, and Connor marveled daily at the transformation he witnessed in his daughter. The wariness that had once defined her every interaction had softened into natural caution, the kind of healthy skepticism that would serve her well in life without crippling her ability to trust worthy people. Her nightmares had become infrequent, replaced by dreams she sometimes shared over breakfast, adventures in mountain meadows, conversations with woodland creatures, plans for projects they might tackle together when spring returned. "Papa," Violet called from her bedroom, using the name that had become as natural to both of them as breathing. "Can you help me with this arithmetic problem? I can't figure out how to divide the lumber measurements." Connor smiled at her request, remembering how Emma had struggled with the same practical applications of mathematics. He'd discovered that Violet had a quick mind for numbers when they related to real projects, calculating feed for the chickens, measuring wood for repairs, determining how many days their winter supplies would last. Abstract problems from textbooks challenged her more, but she approached every lesson with the same determined focus she brought to splitting kindling or tending the garden. "Coming," Connor replied, setting aside his own work on a chair he was building for the front porch. The piece was his first major carpentry project since Sarah's death, a deliberate return to the craft that had once brought him so much satisfaction. Violet had requested something where she could sit and watch the valley while she practiced reading aloud, and Connor had designed the chair specifically for her small frame, while building it sturdy enough to last for decades. As he helped Violet work through the mathematical concepts, Connor found himself thinking about the letter that had arrived the previous week from Tom Murphy. The storekeeper had written to share news from Cedar Ridge, including updates on townspeople Violet had grown fond of during their occasional visits. But the most significant information concerned Harold Pembroke, whose legal troubles had extended far beyond the loss of his parental rights. Dr. Whitman's testimony had prompted investigations into Pembroke's business practices, revealing a pattern of corruption and intimidation that reached into multiple state governments. The man who had once wielded wealth and influence like weapons was now facing criminal charges that would likely result in years of imprisonment. Justice moved slowly, but it moved nonetheless, and Connor took quiet satisfaction in knowing that Pembroke would never again have the power to hurt vulnerable people. "I think I understand now," Violet said, her pencil scratching across the paper as she worked through the problem. "If you're building something, you need to know exactly how much material you need, so you don't waste anything or come up short when you're almost finished." "That's exactly right," Connor confirmed, recognizing the deeper wisdom in her observation. Building anything worthwhile, whether furniture or families, required careful planning, honest assessment of available resources, and the patience to see projects through to completion, even when the work became difficult. The afternoon light was beginning to slant through the kitchen window when they finished the lesson, casting long shadows across the papers that documented Violet's steady progress in reading, writing, and arithmetic. Connor had become her primary teacher by necessity, but he'd discovered an unexpected joy in watching knowledge take root in her eager mind. She absorbed information like mountain soil, absorbed spring rain, gratefully, completely, and with immediate plans for putting new learning to practical use. "Papa," Violet said suddenly, her voice carrying the thoughtful tone that usually preceded important observations. "I've been thinking about something." "What's that?" "When I first came here, I was so afraid that you'd decide I was too much trouble and send me away. But now I realize that I was the one who needed to decide whether this could really be my home." Connor looked up from organizing the lesson papers, struck by the maturity of her insight. "And what did you decide?" Violet smiled, the expression transforming her face with its complete absence of the guardedness that had once defined her every interaction. "I decided that home isn't really about the place. It's about the people who make you feel safe enough to be yourself, who love you not because they have to, but because they choose to." The simple profundity of her words caught Connor by surprise, as her observations often did. This child who had survived experiences that might have broken adults had somehow maintained not just hope, but wisdom, an understanding of love and family that transcended blood relationships and legal definitions. "You're absolutely right," Connor said quietly. "And I want you to know that choosing you as my daughter has been the greatest privilege of my life." As evening approached and they settled into their familiar routine of shared chores and quiet conversation, Connor found himself reflecting on the unexpected paths that had led them to this moment. A year ago, he'd been a man consumed by grief, convinced that his capacity for love had died with his first family. Now he was father to a remarkable child who taught him that the heart's ability to create new bonds was limitless, that healing could happen even after the deepest wounds. The mountain cabin that had once been his refuge from the world had become something far more precious, a home where two people who'd lost everything had found each other and built something beautiful from the remnants of their separate sorrows. The furniture Connor crafted, the lessons he taught, the daily routines they shared, all of it was part of a larger construction project that would continue for years to come. Outside their windows, the first snow of winter was beginning to fall, covering the landscape in pristine white that made everything look new and full of possibility. Connor and Violet stood together at the window, watching the flakes dance in the lamplight, both understanding without words that they'd weathered the storm that had brought them together, and were now ready for whatever seasons lay ahead. They were home, finally and completely, in the truest sense of the word.